Everyone at that head table went quiet when my daughter looked at me and said I wasn't on the list. Then the wedding planner leaned in and asked me, politely, to wait by the coat check until the ceremony was over. I looked at my daughter. I looked at the woman holding a clipboard with my name nowhere on it. Then I set down the gift I'd been carrying for 6 months and walked out into the parking lot alone. Nobody in that ballroom knew that the venue they were standing in, the one with the chandeliers and the marble entrance, existed because I'd signed a loan for it 4 years earlier. My name is Walter Hicks. I'm 63 years old. I've spent 40 years running heavy equipment on highway crews, the kind of man who reads blueprints for bridges and comes home with grease under his fingernails that never fully comes out. I raised my daughter Claire mostly on my own after her mother passed when Claire was 8. I don't wear nice suits, and I don't drive anything newer than 12 years old, but I built more than most people in this story ever understood. And that wedding is where all of it came apart. Diane died in February, the kind of cold Ohio February where the ground's too frozen to dig a proper grave, and they have to wait until spring. Claire was 8. I remember standing in our kitchen the morning after the funeral, looking at a stack of unopened sympathy cards, and understanding that from that point forward, it was just the two of us. I didn't have family nearby to lean on. My own parents were gone, and Diane's people lived out in Arizona and sent Christmas cards instead of showing up, so I did what needed doing. I worked the early shift on road crews starting at 5:30 in the morning, and I structured every other part of my life around getting home in time to make dinner and check homework and sit through piano recitals in a folding metal chair that always left a mark on the back of my legs. Money was tight in ways I never let Claire see. There were winters I put off getting my truck's transmission looked at because the sound it made wasn't quite bad enough yet to justify the cost, and I'd rather drive something that groaned than tell my daughter we couldn't afford new shoes for school. I ate a lot of the same things, beans and rice, mostly, because it stretched, and I made sure Claire had the cereal with the cartoon on the box even when I was eating the store brand oatmeal myself. I never told her any of that. A father doesn't put that weight on an 8-year-old, or a 12-year-old, or even a 16-year-old. You carry it yourself, and you carry it quiet. Claire grew up sharp and ambitious in a way that sometimes scared me a little, if I'm honest. She noticed things early. She noticed that the other kids at her middle school had parents who drove nicer cars and lived in the newer part of town, over by the golf course. And I think somewhere around 7th grade, she started drawing a line in her head between the life we had and the life she wanted. I didn't blame her for it. Kids want things to look a certain way, and it's not really their fault when they can't tell the difference yet between a life that's hard and a life that's small. Those aren't the same thing, but Claire mixed them up early, and I didn't understand how deep that confusion had settled until it was far too late to just talk it out over dinner. By high school, she'd stopped bringing friends home most weekends. She said our house was too far from everyone, which wasn't really true. We were 15 minutes from the school, same as half her class. I think it had more to do with the fact that my truck sat in the driveway with a construction company's magnetic sign still stuck to the door most nights, because I never bothered peeling it off after work. I noticed. I never said anything. I told myself it was a phase. Claire found her calling in event planning almost by accident, the way a lot of people find the thing that actually fits them. She got a part-time job during college helping coordinate small campus functions. And within a semester, she was the one other students went to when they needed a wedding shower or a fundraiser pulled together on short notice. She had an eye for it, a real one. She could walk into an empty room and see exactly how the tables should sit and where the light would hit best at 6 in the evening. I remember visiting her apartment once during her junior year and finding index cards taped to every wall, vendor names and pricing and seating charts, and thinking, this is it. This is the thing that lights her up. The way the kitchen lit up my neighbor's boy, or the way a good engine lights up some men. I told her I'd help, however I could. She graduated, wanting to start her own event and wedding planning company, instead of working under someone else for 5 years, building a client list first, which is what most people in that business do. She was 27. No real credit history, no track record a bank could point to, and every lender she approached in Columbus turned her down without much of a conversation. That's when she came to me one evening at my kitchen table, nervous in a way I hadn't seen from her since she was small, and scared of a thunderstorm, asking whether I still owned the house outright. She needed a cosigner. She needed somebody with clean credit and paid-off property willing to put their name on a commercial loan, and there was exactly one person in her life who fit that description. I said yes, before she'd even finished laying it all out. I'd spent 4 decades building roads and bridges. Other people drove across without ever knowing my name, and here was a chance to help my own daughter build something with hers on it. I didn't think twice. I had no idea that yes would end up costing me something I couldn't put a number on. I took out a second mortgage on the house on Delridge Street, the same house I'd owned free and clear for 9 years after paying it down slow, one extra principal payment at a time, for over 2 decades before that. I co signed a commercial loan for $680,000, backed the equipment lease on top of it personally, and put my name down as a 35% stakeholder in the LLC. Her lawyer drew up because the bank wanted more than just a guarantee. They wanted actual skin in the deal. Claire asked me for one more thing that night, and looking back, I understand now that request told me everything I needed to know if I'd let myself hear it clearly at the time. She asked if we could keep my ownership stake quiet, off the website, off the press materials, out of any conversation with clients or vendors. She said people hire a planner because they believe in her taste, her vision, and having her retired highway crew father listed as a partial owner would muddy that image. She wanted brides and grooms to believe the whole business was hers alone, built from nothing but her own eye and her own grit. I told myself it was just marketing, the kind of thing young business owners think about, branding and image, and I agreed to stay quiet about it. The company was called Marlowe Events, a name she picked because it sounded established, sounded like it had history behind it, even though there was none yet. It opened in a converted loft space downtown with exposed brick and hanging Edison bulbs she'd picked out herself. I stood near the back on the night of her launch party, wearing the one blazer I owned, and I watched my daughter shake hands with local wedding photographers and venue owners like she'd been raised in that world her whole life. Nobody introduced me as anything beyond a family friend who'd stopped by to show support. I told myself it didn't matter. Watching her succeed was payment enough. For a long stretch of years, I actually believed that completely. Marlowe events grew faster than either of us expected. Within 4 years, Claire had built a staff of a dozen, moved into a bigger office space, and started getting written up in regional bridal magazines as one of the Midwest's rising planning talents, the self-made woman who'd built an empire out of nothing but instinct and hustle. Every article told some version of that same story, and every time I read one, I noticed my name wasn't anywhere in it. Not even a passing mention of a father who'd remortgaged his house to make the whole thing possible. I told myself it was fine. I told myself a lot of things were fine during those years. It was around then that Claire started dating Preston Ainsley, whose family owned 3 car dealerships across the county and had their name on a wing of the regional children's hospital. The Ainsleys were old money by Ohio standards, the kind of family with a lake house up near Put-in Bay that had been passed down 2 generations already. Preston's father, Gordon Ainsley, was the sort of man who valued self-sufficiency above nearly every other virtue a person could hold. And Claire fell into that family's orbit easily, like she'd been rehearsing for it her whole life without knowing it. When Preston proposed the following spring, and Claire started planning their engagement party, naturally, at one of the county's nicer venues, I noticed she introduced me to Gordon Ainsley at that party simply as an old family friend who'd helped her out early on. Not her father, just a friend. I remember shaking Gordon's hand, smiling, telling him it was a lovely event, while something in my chest quietly went cold, in a spot I didn't have the right words for yet. I told myself Claire had her reasons, that things would settle once the wedding planning excitement calmed down. It never did. It only got more distant from there, and I let it happen because some part of me still believed being needed quietly was better than not being needed at all. 3 years passed that way, me showing up to holidays and family dinners as a background figure Claire barely acknowledged in front of the Ainsleys, telling myself every single time that it was fine. Then in early autumn, Claire called and asked me to come to her own wedding, obviously, and specifically asked that I arrive early to the venue's cocktail hour so I could meet more of Preston's extended family before the ceremony started. She said it mattered to her that I be there early, not just at the ceremony itself. For the first time in years, I let myself feel a small flicker of something like hope, that maybe this time she'd introduce me the right way, out loud, in front of everyone who mattered to her. I'd been out on a job that whole week, running a grader on a resurfacing project 2 counties over, and I hadn't had time to drive back into the sim change before the venue's early arrival window closed. I showed up in my work jacket and boots, road dust still on my jeans, because I figured my daughter asking me to come early meant more than what I happened to be wearing. I drove 2.5 hours straight, from the job site to the venue, tired and hungry and genuinely happy, thinking about walking my daughter down the aisle in a few hours, and finally, maybe, being introduced as exactly what I was. Walking up to the entrance of the Cobalt Room, the reception hall Claire had chosen, the same hall that existed in that renovated state, partly because of a business loan carrying my signature and my equity stake, I felt something like the pride I used to feel walking Claire into her first day of kindergarten, mixed with a nervousness I couldn't quite place. Through the tall windows, I could see the cocktail hour already underway inside, string lights and white orchids everywhere, the whole Ainsley family gathered in expensive fabric, laughing about something, champagne catching the early evening light. I straightened my jacket as best I could, took a breath, and walked through the front doors toward my daughter and whatever was waiting for me inside. The coordinator at the door recognized me right away, since I'd been to the venue twice already for planning walkthroughs with Claire, and waved me through without checking anything. Stepping into that room felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Soft light and expensive perfume, and everyone dressed like they'd stepped straight out of a magazine spread. Gordon Ainsley stood near the center of the room in a dark suit, laughing at something his brother had just said. Claire spotted me first. I watched her face shift, the easy smile she'd been wearing for Preston's relatives sliding sideways into something tighter and more careful. She crossed the room fast, almost knocking over a server's tray, before I'd even made it a few steps inside. Dad, she said, low and quick, like she was trying to keep the words contained between just the two of us. What are you doing here dressed like that? I told her I'd come straight from a job site, that I hadn't had time to change, that I was sorry if my clothes weren't right for the room. She glanced back over her shoulder at the Ainsley family, and I watched Gordon's sister lean toward another woman and murmur something, both of them glancing our way and not bothering to hide it. Gordon himself was watching too, his face doing that particular thing rich men's faces do when they're quietly deciding whether something in front of them deserves their attention at all. Claire's jaw tightened, and I could see her running some kind of calculation behind her eyes, weighing her father against the family she was about to marry into, and I could see exactly which way that calculation was going to fall before she even opened her mouth to say whatever warmth I'd carried in from the parking lot, whatever small hope I'd been holding on to since her call last week, started draining out of me right there just inside the door. The 2.5 hours of driving suddenly sat heavy in my legs and my lower back all at once. Claire's voice came out sharper than I'd ever heard her use with me, loud enough to carry across half the room. Dad, you can't be in here right now. This isn't the right crowd for you tonight. Please, just wait outside until the ceremony. For a second, I just stood there, not fully processing the words, even though I'd heard every one of them clearly enough. Wait outside. Like I was some stranger who'd wandered in off the street looking for a free drink. Like 23 years of raising her alone counted for nothing next to how I looked standing in a doorway in steel-toed boots. Someone near the bar laughed first, a short, surprised sound that cracked the silence, and then 2 or 3 more voices joined in behind it. Not cruel, exactly. More the careless kind of laughter people offer when they think a joke has landed at someone else's expense, and they don't want to be the one who doesn't get it. Gordon Ainsley didn't laugh, but he didn't say anything either, just watched with that same unreadable expression. 61 years old, and comfortable enough in his own skin to let the moment play itself out without interference. I looked past Claire at that room full of orchids and candlelight, at Preston not quite meeting my eyes, at a life my daughter had built that I'd helped pay for and was now being asked to leave before it even properly started. Nobody in that room knew that the equipment lease keeping the caterer's kitchen running, the loan that had let Claire renovate this very hall 2 years earlier when she took over its event contracts, existed because I'd put my house on the line for her. Nobody knew, because Claire had made very sure of that from the beginning. Standing there in that doorway, I felt something shift inside me, quiet and cold and completely clear. Not anger exactly, more like finally seeing something for precisely what it was, after years of choosing not to look at it straight on. I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene, because that isn't who I am and never has been. I just nodded once, slow, and started to turn toward the door, telling myself I'd wait in the truck until it was time for the ceremony itself, or maybe just drive home and let the whole thing go, the way I'd let so many things go over the years. That's when Renata, the venue's longtime event director, who'd worked with Claire on nearly every contract since Marlowe Events first started booking the Cobalt Room, came around the corner carrying a folder with the final vendor invoice inside, the balance due before the ceremony could officially proceed under their contract terms. Out of pure habit, the kind built over years of watching me quietly settle overages on client accounts whenever Claire was too buried in logistics to notice. Renata walked straight past Claire and held the folder out toward me. The final balance is $6,400, she said, not even looking up from her clipboard. Whenever you're ready, Mr. Hicks. Then she turned to head back toward the kitchen, completely unaware of what had just happened 30 seconds earlier in that exact spot. I looked down at that folder in my hands, and something about it landed different than it ever had before. $6,400 for a room I'd just been told wasn't mine to stand in. In a business that existed, in no small part, because of a loan and an equity stake that had come entirely from me, I opened the folder, looked at the number, closed it again, and set it down gently on the nearest table, my eyes staying on Claire the whole time. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. I turned, walked past the confused faces in the flickering candlelight, out through the front doors, past the coordinator's stand, and into the cold parking lot, leaving that folder sitting exactly where I'd left it. The drive home was quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Not angry quiet. Something deeper and stiller than that. I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove through the dark with my hand steady on the wheel, replaying the whole scene. The laughter, Gordon's unreadable face, Renata setting that folder down without any idea what she'd just walked into. By the time I pulled into my driveway on Delridge Street an hour and a half later, something in me had gone completely still, the way water goes still, right before it turns to ice. I sat in the truck in the dark for a long while before going inside. I thought about Diane, about raising Claire alone all those years and never once letting her see me struggle. I thought about remortgaging this exact house, about co-signing a $680,000 loan, while a loan officer, half my age, walked me through the risks, like I hadn't already understood every one of them. I thought about being introduced as an old family friend at my own daughter's engagement party. Around 10 that night, I called Roy Delgado, an old coworker from the crew who'd left road work 15 years back to finish his law degree and now handled small business contracts out of a storefront office near the courthouse. Roy picked up on the second ring, his voice rough with sleep, and asked what was wrong, because I never called that late unless something actually was. I told him I needed to come by his office first thing in the morning, that I needed him to pull the paperwork on an LLC called Marlowe Events Holdings, and that I needed to understand exactly what rights I still had as a 35% stakeholder who'd just been told to wait outside his own daughter's wedding. Roy's office was small, a converted storefront with a window unit that rattled and diplomas on the wall that had started to yellow at the corners. I sat across from him the next morning while he spread the Marlowe Events paperwork across his desk, the same documents I'd signed 6 years earlier without reading every clause as carefully as I probably should have. Roy read through it slowly, tapping certain pages, asking me questions about exactly what had happened at the venue, and I told him the whole thing without leaving anything out. He found what he was looking for about 15 minutes in, tapping a section of the operating agreement with the cap of his pen. "Walter," he said, looking up over his glasses, "your personal guarantee on the equipment lease isn't locked in permanently. It renews annually because the collateral tied to it is your house, and that renewal comes up again in 6 weeks. There's also a buyout clause in here, standard stuff for a minority stakeholder. That lets you force a valuation and either sell your share or buy out the majority partner. If there's been material misrepresentation of ownership to third parties, vendors, press, that kind of thing, which sounds a whole lot like what's been happening with these magazine write-ups." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something settle into place. I told Roy I wanted to formally decline to renew the personal guarantee when the renewal window opened, through the proper channels, in writing, no drama, no shouting, just the plain mechanics of a man removing his name from something he never should have hidden behind in the first place. I also asked him to draft a letter invoking the buyout clause, giving Claire 90 days to buy out my 35% at fair market value, or the full ownership structure would go into public filing through the standard process. Roy nodded and told me he'd have it ready within the week. For the first time since walking out of that reception hall, I felt something close to steady. The renewal notice went out from the bank exactly on schedule, 6 weeks later, informing Marlowe Events Holdings that the personal guarantee backing their equipment, lease, and line of credit would not be renewed under current terms, and that the business needed to secure new collateral or a new guarantor within 30 days to avoid the accounts being called. I learned later from Roy that Claire's loan officer called her directly the same afternoon the notice arrived, walking her through exactly whose signature had been holding the financial structure of Marlowe events together since the very beginning. Claire had never actually looked closely at those original loan documents. Not really. She'd signed where Roy and I told her to sign 6 years earlier, when she was 27, and desperate to start her own company. Trusting that her father had handled the fine print the way I'd handled every hard detail of her life up until that point. Now, sitting across from a loan officer explaining that the financial foundation underneath her entire company rested on her father's house and her father's credit, Claire was hearing the true shape of her own success story for the first time. According to Roy, who got a call from the bank's legal department confirming receipt of our buyout letter that same week, Claire went pale, sitting in that meeting, and asked to see the original documents pulled up. She sat there in silence for almost a full minute, staring at my signature on page after page, at the house on Delridge Street listed as collateral, at the 35% ownership stake that had been sitting quietly in her father's name since before Marlowe Events ever opened its doors. Whatever story she'd built about herself over 6 years, the self-made narrative she'd handed to magazines and future in-laws alike, was sitting right there in black and white, coming apart in front of her. Claire called me 14 times over the next 3 days, and I let every single call go to voicemail. Not out of spite, but because I genuinely had nothing left to say that hadn't already been said standing in that doorway. On the fourth day, she showed up at my house, unannounced, standing on the porch where I'd stood so many evenings waiting for her school bus. Except now the roles felt strange, and reversed in a way neither of us was used to. She looked different than she had at the venue. The polish worn thin, dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept properly in days. "Dad," she said, "we need to talk about the bank letter, about the buyout thing your lawyer sent." I invited her in, made 2 cups of coffee the way I always had, and sat across from her at the same kitchen table where she'd once asked me to put my house on the line to help her chase her dream. She asked why I was doing this now. After everything, after all the years I'd stayed quiet, and let things be however she needed them to be. I told her the truth, plain and steady, the way I'd learned to say hard things over a lifetime of not saying them soon enough. I told her I wasn't doing anything to her. I was just done doing something for her that she'd never once acknowledged out loud. Done being a silent partner in a life where I wasn't even allowed to stand in the room. I told her that pulling my guarantee wasn't revenge. It was just me finally treating my own name and my own house the way she'd taught me. She treated me as something to use quietly and keep out of sight when it was convenient. She sat there a long time without answering, staring into her coffee, and for the first time in years, I watched my daughter actually run out of words. Word travels fast in circles like the Ainsleys, and within 2 weeks of that bank letter going out, Gordon Ainsley had heard the whole story, not from me, but from his own accountant, who'd caught wind of the loan situation through a mutual contact at the bank. Gordon called Preston directly one evening and asked him point blank whether it was true that Marlowe Events had been financed and backed this entire time by Claire's father, the same father who'd been told to wait outside their own wedding reception. I heard about that conversation secondhand a few weeks later, through Preston himself, who called me one afternoon sounding shaken in a way I hadn't expected from him. He told me his father had always respected self-reliance above nearly everything else, that it was the whole foundation of how the Ainsley family measured a person's character, and that finding out Claire's success had actually been quietly financed and guaranteed by a father she'd erased from the public story, had shifted something permanently in how Gordon viewed her. Preston said his father used the word disappointed, and in that family, apparently, that word carried more weight than anger ever could. Gordon Ainsley, I learned, had built his own dealership empire from a single failing lot his own father left him in debt decades earlier. And the one thing he could not tolerate, above almost any other flaw, was dishonesty about where a person's success actually came from. Claire had spent 6 years building an image of herself as exactly that kind of self-made woman, in front of exactly the kind of family that valued that story more than almost anything else. Now the whole foundation of that image had cracked open in front of the very people whose respect she'd been chasing the entire time. Marlowe Events lost 2 of its biggest annual contracts within a month, corporate accounts that had been referred through Ainsley family connections in the first place, and without my guarantee backing the equipment lease, and without Claire having built enough independent credit or savings after years spent assuming her father's name would quietly cover whatever gaps appeared, the company had to lay off half its staff by winter. The downtown office closed in January, and Claire moved operations into a small shared workspace, running things mostly alone for the first time since the business started. Preston didn't call off the wedding, but something between them had shifted permanently. the way Claire described it to me later. She said discovering how deep the deception ran, not just with me, but in what she'd let Preston and his family believe about her, made her look back at the whole relationship differently, wondering what else she'd been willing to shade for the sake of a good story. Gordon Ainsley pulled back considerably from the informal introductions and vendor referrals he used to offer Claire freely, the kind of quiet advantage that comes with marrying into a family like that, treating her now with a careful, watchful distance instead of the easy warmth he'd shown before. Claire lost weight over those months, showed up to a couple of family gatherings, looking smaller somehow, the confidence that used to fill a room replaced by something more careful and uncertain. I didn't take any pleasure in watching it happen, and I want to be honest about that, because I'd spent too many years loving that girl to feel good about any part of her life falling apart. But I also didn't step in to soften any of it, because for the first time in her adult life, Claire was standing in front of consequences that belonged entirely to her, built from choices she'd made without me standing quietly behind her, covering the gaps. Claire came back to Delridge Street on a Sunday afternoon in early spring, parking on the street instead of the driveway like she used to, and knocked on the front door instead of just walking in the way she'd done her whole life growing up in that house. I opened the door and found her standing there in a plain sweater, no polish left in how she carried herself, just a tired woman in her 30s who looked, for the first time in a long while, like she actually wanted to say something true. We sat on the back porch, where I used to watch her practice cartwheels in the yard, and she talked for almost an hour without me interrupting once. She told me she'd been ashamed of where we came from since she was 12 years old, ashamed of the truck and the work boots and the small house, and that shame had curdled into something uglier over the years, a need to erase the parts of her story that felt too plain for the world she wanted to belong to. She said she understood now that erasing me from her story meant erasing the only person who'd ever shown up for her without asking for anything back. She said she was sorry in a way that didn't sound rehearsed, just plain and a little broken. I told her I appreciated hearing that, and that I believed her, but that things weren't going back to exactly how they'd been before that wedding. I told her if she wanted me in her life going forward, it would have to be as her father, out loud, in front of whoever happened to be standing in the room, not as a quiet arrangement she pulled out when it was useful and put away when it wasn't. She nodded, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she reached over and hugged me the way she used to as a little girl, not performing anything for anyone, just two people sitting on a porch trying to find their way back to something honest. It's been almost a year now since that wedding at the Cobalt Room, and things look different than they used to, though not the way the magazines would have written it before. Claire runs what's left of Marlowe Events herself now, smaller, leaner, without my guarantee behind it anymore, working the kind of long hours I used to work back when she was a kid, watching me leave the house before sunrise. She calls me most weeks. Actually calls, not just when something's needed. Lao, you introduced me to a new client's family as her father. Plain and simple. No old family friend. No careful editing of the truth. Gordon Ainsley and I have spoken a handful of times since everything settled, and I've found him to be a more decent man than that first impression at the engagement party suggested. Someone who respects a person more once he understands what they actually built with their own two hands. He told me once, over coffee, Claire arranged a little awkwardly between us, that he wished he'd known the real story years earlier, that a man who remortgaged his house for his daughter's dream deserved more respect at that table than most of the people who'd laughed that evening ever did. I still drive the same old truck. I still come home most days with road dust on my jeans from whatever stretch of highway I'm working, but I sit at family tables now without wondering whether I actually belong there, because Claire finally understands what it cost to build the life she has, and she stopped pretending that cost might belong to her alone. Some nights I think back to standing in that doorway, hearing my own daughter tell me to wait outside, and I realize that moment didn't destroy anything that was actually worth keeping. It just finally showed me, clear as anything, exactly what needed to change, and gave me the push to change it.